We looked at the worst draft day comparisons in current memory, and we're going back and looking at some of the worst comparisons of all time. We can't go too far back though, because the draft day comparisons didn't really start until the year 2000, but even starting just back then, you're gonna see it's given us some pretty terrible ones. So for this video, we're gonna have some of the older all-time ones mixed in with a couple of newer, more recent ones I found. And we're also gonna try to not mention any that we already talked about in the other video, so if you don't see one you might have been expecting, watch the other video. That's the first link in the description first, and you'll probably see it there. Also, make sure you stay tuned all the way until the end for the absolute worst draft day comparison of all time. And last thing I should mention is that for most of these, we're using the comparisons from NBADraft.net, and the first player we're looking at is Kwame Brown, who was known as the biggest bust in NBA history before Anthony Bennett, because he went first overall straight out of high school and got enough hype for that to happen because he was 6'11" and 275 pounds as a senior, and his size and athleticism at such a young age was what impressed scouts so much, and combine that with his ability to hit mid-range shots convinced a lot of people that he was a first overall pick. As for his draft day comparison though, well, NBADraft.net had him compared to Kevin Garnett, which was still terrible, but not nearly as bad as the comparison that was going around from some of the other scouts, because many other scouts compared Kwame to Karl Malone and Chris Webber thanks to his NBA-sized frame. And not only that, but they said he played like a guard in a center's body, claiming that he could handle the ball very well and even lead the fast break. So they were saying we had someone the size of Karl Malone that played like a guard. And this is without a doubt one of the worst comparisons of all time, but trust me, it gets worse. And staying on the theme of NBA draft busts, there's Darko Milicic, who had nearly every scout fooled into thinking he was the next Dirk Nowitzki, because he was drafted at a time when overseas players were the big thing, and even to this day, but especially back then, scouts wouldn't do too much research about overseas players, but if they were tall, foreign, and had a jump shot, then chances were they were compared to Dirk at one point or another. But not only was he compared to Dirk, he was said to have been a better version of him that could post up and score with both hands, stretch the floor to mid-range and three, and had incredible shot blocking ability. And not only did that lead to him going second overall, when he probably should have gone late in the second round if anything, but it infamously led to him being picked one spot behind LeBron James and ahead of Carmelo Anthony, Chris Bosh, and Dwayne Wade, without a doubt making this one of the biggest draft day mistakes of all time. So it was clear that scouts didn't do their research on Darko, because he only averaged 6 points and 4 rebounds a game in his 10-year career. Looking at a more recent comparison though, in 2015, Emmanuel Mudiay's NBA comparison, according to NBADraft.net, was John Wall, because he was said to have been a rare combination of size, speed, agility, and athleticism to go with the vision and mentality of a point guard. And scouts said that he was a true pass-first kind of point guard that would be a great finisher at the rim, but basically all of the strengths in his report were based on his athleticism, and all of his weaknesses were based on how he actually played the game, which makes it clear that he probably should have never been compared to John Wall in the first place. And seeing how he's played since being in the league makes it clear that he really shouldn't have. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying he's a bad player, because he's a great athlete and makes for a solid backup point guard for any team, but they should have found a better comparison for him than to one of the best overall point guards in the league at the time. Then we have Giannis, and NBADraft.net had his draft day comparison as Nicolas Batum. Alright, we'll be fair with this one. At the time that Giannis was going into the draft, it was 2013, and when the comparison took place was when Nick was still a pretty solid two-way player for the playoff Blazers team, so we'll give him that. Plus, at the time, Giannis wasn't a great player anywhere near where he's at today, and seeing him back then, you could see how they would have made this comparison. But this is an all-time worst draft day comparison still, because it's not scouts' jobs to make projections based on where players are currently at and how good they currently look. It's their job to get insight on a player, who they are, and make the most accurate prediction of the player that they will become. Because the whole point of drafting a player is for their future. And seeing how Giannis has turned out, they did a pretty terrible job. Don't get me wrong, not many people saw this coming from Giannis, but given that it's scouts' jobs to do so, we're allowed to knock him for it. One that's not up for debate is Eddie Curry, who in 2001 was compared to Shaquille O'Neal. Shaq, a unanimous top 10 player of all time, the most dominant force in NBA history, was used to describe Eddie Curry. And in his draft report, one line even says he has more strengths and polish than Shaq at the same age, and does not have the Achilles free throw curse that that himself and Wilt Chamberlain had. And he was drafted 4th overall the same year as Kwame Brown, which just starts to make this look like a whack draft. Honestly though, Eddie got those comparisons almost solely for his wide frame and being able to still play while being 7 foot tall and 300 pounds, while also showing some ability to fight through double and triple teams. But I mean, is that really all it takes to get compared to Shaq? He had a solid 11-year career averaging 12 and 5, so even though he struggled with his weight, he wasn't a terrible player, but honestly the Shaq comparisons were a little much. And I guess so were Michael Beasley's comparisons to Carmelo Anthony. I mean, at the time I get it made sense. Michael Beasley dominated in high school, averaging 28 and 16 as a senior, then averaged 26 and 12 for his 1 year at Kansas State, on 53% from the field and 38% from 3, in what was one of the better college seasons of all time. And the Melo comparisons were there. He could shoot mid-range, from 3, post up, and on top of that was a great all-around athlete. So much so that he was in discussions to go 1st overall over Derrick Rose, but ultimately went 2nd to the Miami Heat in 2008. And I mean, on the court, scouts had it right. He really did have what it took to be a superstar level player, but it was everything off the court that really derailed his NBA career. And it was what scouts didn't manage to see back then that would be the biggest factor in ruining his career. So I mean, honestly, this one's not a terrible comparison, but in the long term, he didn't turn out to be the player he was expected to. Then there's Alexei Shved, and this is a guy you may or may not remember from his brief run on the Timberwolves in 2012 and 13. I mean, if you don't remember him, it's because there was nothing memorable about him, except for the fact that before joining the NBA, he was claimed to be a 6'7" natural point guard whose NBA comparison was Penny Hardaway. Scouts said that in Russia he was an explosive scorer and playmaker like Penny Hardaway and could play on both ends. But he rarely ever played point guard while in the league, and only lasted 3 seasons overall, averaging 7 points, 2 assists, and started 25 total games in his career before going back overseas. I mean, comparing him to Penny Hardaway for what just seemed to have been his size seems pretty unnecessary looking back. And speaking of unnecessary, here we have Adam Morrison. Now, knowing that Adam Morrison would get drafted 3rd overall, then turn into one of the biggest busts we've ever seen, and looking back and remembering that his draft day comparison was Larry Bird, is one of the most incredible scouting errors ever. But it's also a reminder that not everyone translates to the NBA. Because while scouts definitely had that part wrong, in college, I mean, a Larry Bird comparison was really believable. He was averaging 28 a game as a senior, on 43% from 3, and while he wasn't athletic, he knew how to maneuver and score with ease. But once Michael Jordan selected him on the Bobcats, it was all downhill from there. He was the 3rd overall pick and only played 2 seasons on the Bobcats and 2 seasons on the Lakers, winning 2 championships, but being a complete meme for his participation or lack thereof on those teams. A more current terrible draft day comparison though goes to Trey Burke, because he was said to have resembled a cross between Kyle Lowry and Kemba Walker, all while being reminiscent of Damian Lillard, and having a better grip on passing in the pick and roll than Kemba Walker. And I mean, I haven't seen that much at all from him. Fans have wanted to compare him to Allen Iverson because he came out looking like his twin a couple of seasons ago, but their games aren't really that similar. They both have a good crossover and a street ball kind of feel, but the comparisons stop there because of how much more athletic AI was. And I have no idea where the Damian Lillard comparison comes in because he's also a much better athlete, drives to the basket a lot more often, and while they do both have solid mid-range games, that's also not enough for a comparison. As for the Kyle Lowry and Kemba Walker comparison, I mean, I could see his playstyle matching with both Kemba and Kyle's, but he plays nowhere near the level that they do. Then for Dwayne Wade, there's no bad comparison here, but what scouts said about him before the draft was at least worth mentioning during this video, because they said that he should be taken 11th or 12th overall in 2003, and that he should be converted to a point guard when joining the NBA, because at 6'3" he was way too short for a shooting guard, and on top of that, they even thought he was much shorter than the 6'3" that Marquette had listed him. So they said that he could one day be a starter on a team, and that his ceiling was Gilbert Arenas. I mean, at this point, what are scouts even for? Like, what's the point of them if it's just a 50-50 on if they get things right or not? And a perfect example of that is for the worst comparison of the video and the worst NBA draft day comparison of all time with Deshaun Stevenson, who takes this one for being compared to Michael Jordan. And some of you won't even know who Deshaun is, which I mean is even more of a reason for this to be an outrageous claim. I mean, to start, he never averaged over 11 points a game, was a role player for most of his career, and and obviously never came close to living up to the hype. NBADraft.net even tried to defend their claim in 2015 after their scouting report went viral by saying, "Lesson learned, never compare anyone to Michael Jordan." This was in the year 2000, the site was just getting started, but go watch a tape of Stevenson in high school. He was incredible. One of the most spectacular 17-year-old wings you could ever see, but not going to college had a catastrophic effect on him. And I mean, it's true, he did skip out on college and go straight out of high school after his grades came into question. But hold on there. So they didn't compare a college kid to MJ, they compared a 17-year-old fresh out of high school to him, which makes matters even worse. And they didn't blame a bad scouting report on themselves, they blamed it on him skipping college. So that's a big L for them. But luckily, we have a very poorly recorded version of Deshaun Stevenson's aforementioned high school mixtape to review. And honestly, as you can see, there's some impressive athleticism here, but I mean really nothing too crazy. So this will probably forever be the worst draft day comparison. And honestly, it's not Deshaun's fault because he didn't compare himself to MJ, but he had to deal with the backlash and pressure from it as a 17-year-old. Plus, he just so happened to get drafted 23rd overall in 2000, which was odd. But like I said, that was the worst and the last one we had for today. With basketball out of people's minds during everything, views are down, so I appreciate everyone's support who's still watching. Just make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already so we can keep things going, and I'll catch you next video.